Alright, in this video we're going to break down part 2 of period 8, 1945 to 1980. This is the domestic review. Make sure if you haven't already done so, go check out part 1 and learn all about the foreign policy stuff. Another important thing to keep in mind is the fact that liberal principles came to dominate post-war politics and court decisions. Little context for you, the image of prosperity of the 1950s was called into question with publication of The Other America by Michael Harrington, which brought to the attention of the nation poverty in America, and the continued lack of civil rights remained a problem. Johnson's Great Society is going to dramatically increase the scope and size of the federal government. This is considered the high tide of liberalism. Keep in mind, Presidents Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy also had their own liberal agendas domestically, but it's really going to be Johnson's presidency where you're going to see a lot of movement in this area. You have programs like Head Start, which provided affordable preschool, Job Corps, which gave vocational education, Medicare, healthcare for those over the age of 65, Medicaid, healthcare for the poor and disabled. You have a huge reform with immigration in the form of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. This ended the quotas designed to restrict certain nationalities, got rid of those quotas from the 1920s, and as a result, post-1965 immigration to the U.S. is going to be very different as people from Asia, Latin America, and other parts of the globe are able to come in increasing numbers. We're going to take a look at the Great Society's civil rights contributions in another slide. It's also important to keep in mind, though, that Supreme Court decisions of the Warren Court also greatly expanded individual freedoms and democracy. A couple of examples of this expansion of freedom and democracy can be seen in Yates versus U.S., where the court rules the First Amendment protects radical and revolutionary speech. Griswold versus Connecticut states citizens have a right to privacy, thus birth control cannot be prohibited. And in the famous case of Miranda versus Arizona, you get the establishment of the Miranda rights, the right to remain silent, to speak with an attorney, protection for those accused of a crime. In spite of all these different reforms, including the civil rights ones we'll look at in just a second, it's important to note that the rise of liberalism will be accompanied by criticisms from both the left and the right, which leads us to what were those criticisms. On the left, people felt that not enough was being done for civil rights and poverty, and you're going to see the rise of black radicalism, black power movement in the form of groups like the Black Panthers and Malcolm X. More on them in just a moment. Many on the left were highly critical of U.S. foreign policy. Johnson's Great Society is really going to be undone by his role of escalating the war in Vietnam. Many people were increasingly opposed to the war, as we have already mentioned, because of things like the Tet Offensive, the My Lai Massacre, the bombing of Cambodia, and they felt U.S. foreign policy were increasingly immoral. On the left, you see the rise of the UC Berkeley Free Speech Movement, the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, which issued the Port Huron Statement, and other so-called New Left movements spread across college campuses. And really, this division can be seen at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. In 1968, Johnson refuses to run for re-election, and riots occur outside the DNC's convention. On the right, you're going to have criticisms. In fact, in the election of 1964, Barry Goldwater loses to Lyndon Johnson, but he starts to represent the rising conservative movement. They have many different criticisms of liberalism. They don't like a large federal government. They criticize the high deficits and cost of programs under the Great Society, under the New Deal. They did not like the decisions of the Warren Court. They felt that these judges were being activist judges making laws rather than interpreting laws. And they increasingly felt the traditional morality was being undermined, especially after the Roe versus Wade decision in 1973. Conservatives are going to get a big victory in 1968 with the election of Republican Richard Nixon. However, his presidency domestically will come undone as a result of the Watergate scandal, which will further erode trust in the federal government. But in 1980, you're going to really see conservative triumph with the election of Ronald Reagan as he pursues his policies of Reaganomics, tax cuts for the rich, and deregulation. Along with the triumph of conservatism in the 1980s, you're going to see a rising Christian fundamentalist movement mobilizing on a variety of social issues. Make sure you know about civil rights, and one of the key things about this is that all three branches of government helped advance the cause of civil rights and greater racial justice. We saw this with the executive branch. Remember, Harry Truman, following World War II, desegregated the military with Executive Order 9981. This led to Southern Democrats, some forming the Dixiecrats. We saw this with the judicial branch. Plessy versus Ferguson is overturned in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, where the court ruled segregation is inherently unequal and must end with all deliberate speed. And under Johnson, the legislative branch, Congress passed, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made segregation illegal in all public facilities and established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that banned discrimination in employment. You also see in 1965, part of the Great Society, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ended efforts to prevent African Americans from voting in the South. So literacy tests are banned. And then, of course, the 24th Amendment, poll taxes were ruled unconstitutional. In spite of these three branches of government helping advance the cause of civil rights, it's really important you understand that civil rights advocates sought to fulfill the Reconstruction era promises and managed to slowly achieve some legal and political success. And way before the government was doing anything, you see civil rights organizations doing this work. World War II energized the civil rights movement. You have the Double Victory campaign, organizations like CORE forming, and the NAACP membership increased. There's a variety of tactics to trying to fight for civil rights. These include legal challenges, direct action, and nonviolence. And as we already stated, remember the NAACP, led by Thurgood Marshall, managed to win a victory against segregation in the Brown v. Board of Education. Other examples of civil rights victories and protests, you have the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, sparked by the arrest of Rosa Parks, the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins, Freedom Riders rode buses organized by the Congress of Racial Equality into the segregated South, and the Freedom Summer, where civil rights activists sought to register people to vote. Fannie Lou Hamer takes a big role in this movement with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1964. And really important to keep in mind is you're going to have various grassroots movements pressuring for civil rights well into the 1960s, pressuring the government to do more. In spite of this mobilization, you're going to see intense resistance slowed the pace of desegregation. In fact, following the Brown versus Board of Education decision, you have the Southern Manifesto, which denounced the Brown decision, and Southerners criticized the Supreme Court. In Arkansas, you have the Little Rock Nine being prevented from going to school. President Eisenhower has to send in troops to finally protect the Little Rock Nine. And violence is going to occur during many of these civil rights protests, such as the Freedom Rides, the Freedom Summer. Civil rights activists are going to be murdered, and various other forms of resistance and violence. As a result of this slow pace of change and this continued Southern resistance, you're going to have tactical and philosophical differences increase between civil rights organizations. Some of the civil rights movement began to question the nonviolent tactics and philosophy. In 1965, in Watts, you have the riots break out following an arrest of a black motorist by white police officers. Member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Stokely Carmichael, called for black power, economic power in the black community, racial separatism, and Malcolm X joined the Nation of Islam, and he emphasized black nationalism, self-improvement, and separatism as well. And in Oakland, California, you have the Black Panthers, formed by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who called for community organizing as well as African Americans to arm themselves. Partly because they are inspired by the success and activism of the civil rights movement and growing awareness of the inequalities in American society, other groups began to mobilize. In 1963, Betty Friedan, with the Feminine Mystique, challenged traditional gender roles. In the 1950s and 60s, the family structure was changing as the number of women working increased. You see organizations like NOW, the National Organization of Women, founded by women's rights activists, bringing attention to the issue of inequality with regard to women, and we start seeing some victories occur, such as in 1972, Congress passed Title IX, which sought to end sex discrimination in schools. In spite of that victory, the Equal Rights Amendment fell short of ratification by 3 states. A lot of the opposition came from good old Phyllis, And in 1973, the Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade struck down laws prohibiting abortion on the grounds that they were a violation of a woman's right to privacy. And this decision legalizes abortion. You're going to see the rise of other civil rights movements such as the American Indian movement. It's founded in 1968 and it brought attention to the plight of Native people in American life. You're going to have occupations of federal land like at Alcatraz. Cesar Chavez leads the United Farm Workers movement, organizing farm workers and leading a national grape boycott, getting a victory for those individuals. The Immigration Act, as we mentioned, allows for new immigrants to come into the U.S., increasingly making America more and more diverse. And in 1978, the University of California versus Bake, it upheld affirmative action, which basically means race could be one of several factors in admission to the university. The LGBT movement, it's important to know about. In 1968, there are the Stonewall riots, which is really considered the birth of the gay rights movement in American society. Finally, let's close out with some kind of quick overview of society and economics in this time period. Remember, rapid economic and social changes in American society in the post-World War II years led to a sense of optimism, but it also increased tensions. What the heck am I talking about? The rise of the American middle class is a key part of this time period, especially the late 40s and throughout the 50s, as Americans enjoyed increased social mobility. You have a mass movement in the 50s to the suburbs, places like Levittown, and there's a post-war baby boom. And a lot of this economic growth comes from Cold War defense spending in places like the West Coast, but also in the Sun Belt. Out in the South, in the West, this area is going to become increasingly important, both economic and politically. Television plays a role in this standardization of American culture, but there is going to be challenges to the conformity of the 1950s, and you're going to see that in the growth of the beat movement, the beatniks, rock and roll music, and really in the 1960s, you're going to see the rise of a counterculture, for example, the hippies, which rejected many of the social, economic, and political values of the previous generation. In the 60s, you're going to see a sexual revolution where birth control such as the pill, which becomes available in 1960, and access to abortion with Roe v. Wade is going to allow for all sorts of changes in American society. These changes do lead to significant political and moral debates, and as mentioned previously, you're going to see the rise of the conservative movement, not just for political reasons, but also in their minds for moral reasons with the Christian fundamentalists. And it's important you know the causes of this. You have this fear of juvenile delinquency, for example, the hippies, the growing urban unrest in the 1960s, the challenges to the traditional family, and the perceived failures of the federal government policies during the New Deal and the Great Society. All of these things led to efforts to promote conservatives and Christian fundamentalists to promote their own values and ideology. That's going to wrap up the review of the domestic stuff for period 8. Click any one of these videos to learn a whole lot more. And if you haven't already done so, click on the link to part 1 where we look at foreign policy in period 8. If the video helped you out, make sure you click like, post comments if you have any questions, subscribe if you haven't done so, tell all your friends about the channel. And when you take that exam in May, try to get that 5, get that college credit. You're almost to the finish line. Peace.